What's the creepiest thing that happened to you? Story 1. I was catching the last train back from London and had about an hour to wait at a station where I needed to change. It was late at night, I was on my own, and the station did not have many people in it. I decided that this was a good time to have a little wander around the platforms, stretch my legs a bit, and enjoy the wait. I ended up walking down a platform with no more scheduled journeys for the night, so naturally there were very few of us there. Actually, there were just two of us, me and a little girl. It is quite unusual to see a young girl standing on her own in the middle of the night, and I was not sure if I did the right thing or not, but I stopped walking, sat on a bench about 20 meters away, and decided to subtly keep an eye on her to make sure she was okay. At first, I assumed her mother had probably gone to the toilet or something and asked her to stay in the same place until her return, but children should not be alone like that. So I sat there and decided to be a temporary guardian for her. This girl was standing down the platform and appeared to be about 10 years old in her school uniform. From what I could tell, she was Asian and seemed confident standing where she was. Very, very still, because after 5 minutes passed, this little girl was still standing in exactly the same position she had been in before. I had not seen her move an inch. I sat there on the bench thinking about what could have happened. Had her mother told her to stay there and then left her? Had she been separated from her carer? Maybe I should wait a bit longer. And she just stood there in the same position, right arm clutched to her body, staring directly at me. 10 minutes passed. 15. It was winter and the platforms were cold. This little girl must have been freezing, but she was just standing there, staring at me. I could feel her eyes burning into me. Was she upset? Was I imagining things? I considered going to find help, but then a cleaner walked past her. He did not even look at her. He just swept by and went on his way. He would not just let a child stand there, right? Was she not real? If I got up to get help, then I would have to take my eyes off the girl. And what if she ran away? What if someone else approached her? No, her safety was important. 20 minutes. It was getting ridiculous. This poor little girl had been abandoned or something. I decided that when 25 minutes passed, if nothing had happened, I would go ask her if she was okay. I do not know why I did not do so sooner, but I was hoping her parents would come collect her. As long as I kept a lookout, everything would be okay. 22 minutes passed, and she was still standing there, staring at me from a distance. I needed to take a picture and send it to someone to make sure I was not imagining things, like a sleepy hallucination or some kind of break, because this apparently invisible child was just standing there, glaring in my direction. I swear this is true. Here is what came out on my phone's camera. I sent it to my boyfriend at the time for confirmation. No, I was not imagining things. I was not dreaming. I needed to go help her. And 25 minutes later, she was still standing there, dead still, staring at me in the freezing cold, in the middle of the night. Just me and her, on this dark and eerie platform. I stood up and slowly walked towards her. I got a bit closer, and she remained still. As I got closer, it was probably the most shocking moment I had ever experienced. I saw her face, the shadows hitting it under the dim station lights. It looked half melted, like she had no real eyes. My heart was racing faster and faster. I could not stop now. This poor girl was probably a victim of a terrible accident, and definitely not something else. Just because she stood so still for so long in the cold weather and stared at me. Well, maybe she did not really stare. She did not have eyes. Wait, what if she was not real? Was this my last moment? No, I told myself. She was just a poor little girl. I was scared, I admit. But I knew that this girl with the melted face needed help. I needed to go ask if she was okay. Besides, what kind of person would I be if I just left her there? As I got closer, it became more clear. She was deformed, abandoned, a poor child. But I could not help being scared, even as I pressed on. I walked closer, opened my mouth to ask her something, trembling, and I could not believe what I saw. She was made of Lego. She was an art installation made of Lego. Just standing there, being eerie, staring at people, and being made of Lego. Story 2. I went to a community college for 1 year before I transferred to a 4-year school. There was this really awkward-looking guy in almost all my classes since I was just taking general education courses. And I also saw him everywhere around campus. In class, there he was. In the student center, there he was. Waiting to order some food, there he was. I never actually spoke to him, but he was everywhere. It was a small school, so you tend to see a lot of people around campus, but I never saw anyone quite as much as him. Then I transferred to a different school that was 2 hours away. I moved into my dorm and got ready to start classes. On the very first day, I went to my first class, and there he was, sitting right in the first row. The same guy that I saw everywhere at the first school showed up in my first class after I transferred. I never saw him again after that semester, though. Story 3. About 3 years ago, I lived alone in my apartment. My ex had come over late to spend the night with me. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, someone tried to kick my front door in. It was seriously the loudest noise I had ever heard. We were certain they had broken in. My dogs were going crazy. I had no weapon to protect us. My boyfriend grabbed a bat and stood at my bedroom door, while I hid in the closet trying to call a neighbor and the police. Finally, the neighbors and officers arrived. Some man had urinated all over my front door, but had never actually gotten inside. About a week later, I was cleaning my apartment and had the glass sliding door to my patio open. I was on the first floor, but I had the screen door locked. While I was cleaning, my dog suddenly started growling ferociously. I rushed to the living room and saw some man under my patio having a standoff with my 150-pound bull mastiff. Once he saw me and realized my dog could seriously hurt him, he ran away. 2 days later, I found 3 long-stem roses sitting on my patio. The only way to reach my patio was either through my apartment or by jumping the little fence that surrounded it. About a week later, I noticed that the screen door had been cut along the edge, making an opening big enough to fit through. Around the same time, one of my neighbors called to make sure my doors were locked because there was a man pacing back and forth in front of my apartment door. A detective was assigned to me during this time. She suggested that someone might be stalking me. I wanted to move, but her response was, "If someone is watching you, they will just follow you." I felt completely helpless until suddenly it all stopped. I can only imagine that whoever it was either found someone else or something bad happened to them. The kicking at my door, the urination, the flowers, it all still gives me chills. Story 4. When I was about 10 years old, we lived just on the outskirts of the city. We had 2 driveways, one on the right side of the house and the other on the left side, farther away from the house, that led to the garage. At around 11 o'clock at night, my stepdad went to pick up my older brother from work. I was at home with my mother and siblings. I was the oldest. My mother was asleep because she had to get up at 5 in the morning. I heard a knock at the door, and foolish me answered it, thinking it was my stepdad and brother who had been locked out. I opened the door, and there stood a white man who looked to be in his 50s. His car was parked in the right-hand driveway. He asked if I knew where Wolf Street was. He had come from that direction. I said yes because we passed it on our way to the house. It was about a mile down the road in a predominantly black neighborhood. I pointed in the direction it was, and then he asked sternly, "Is anyone else home?" I said, "Yes, my mother is here." He then asked where my father was, and luckily they were passing the house and getting ready to pull into the driveway by the garage. I pointed and said, "Right there." He quickly turned and started walking back to his car. My stepdad came in furious. He asked what that had been about, and I told him. He said I could have been kidnapped because the car had 3 other men, and the man had acted very suspiciously when they drove off. I do not know if I would have been kidnapped, especially with my mother there, but who knows. Story 5. I had a girl stalking me last year while I was in college. I brought her home one night and did the typical college thing and did not text her back. After that, she did a whole bunch of creepy things. She climbed the tree in our backyard some nights, which had a direct view into my window, and sent me pictures of me sleeping. I am 99% sure she entered my house when my roommates and I were in class and went through my things. I do not know if she left a hidden camera or not. She would get my roommates to give her a ride back so she could get into my bed when I returned. She told me she would kill herself if I did not agree to go out with her. She once got into a party at our place and slipped something into my drink. Luckily, the party was broken up, and my friend put me in my bed and locked the door before she could reach me. There is much more, and it did not stop until I graduated. She still texts me every few weeks wondering where I am. Thank goodness she does not know where I live. I called the police several times and she was arrested once. I did not want to file for a restraining order because I did not want my mother to get involved and worry. For anyone dealing with stalkers, it is not okay. I was extremely scared. Story 6. When I was about 8 or 9, my sister, a friend, and I were walking into the next neighborhood to fetch another friend. We knocked on the door and talked for a few minutes, and then looked back toward the space between the two houses we had walked past to get there. We saw two people, a man and a woman, walk over and just block that space. They both stood there staring at us. The friend told us we had to go now, but we did not know what to do since these two people were standing there. There was another way to get back, but it took longer and meant walking across a busy road, not an attractive idea for several 8-year-olds. We knocked again and asked our friend's mother to walk us back the long way. She did, and as we hit the road, the two people started following us, even though her mother was with us. We crossed the busy road, and then her mother left us. The two people ran across the street and walked behind us. We began to run. They ran and followed us all the way back into the neighborhood. We sprinted into our other friend's backyard and hid. They continued to walk around the neighborhood looking for us. We ran around behind the houses until we reached our house. We looked out the window and they kept searching. They stood there for about an hour before finally leaving. It was not much beyond that, but it was very creepy to us back then. Story 7. You have probably heard that San Francisco is home to some unusual characters, but it is rare to hear about one locking themselves in your bathroom. After my first year of college, I decided that I wanted a place of my own. There was nothing wrong with the dormitories, but I preferred the control and the quiet that a little privacy would afford. I rented a place about 2 blocks from campus, and it seemed perfect. Inexpensive for San Francisco, close to public transportation, and within walking distance of shopping and laundry. However, there was one thing, a person actually, that made living there a bit strange. One afternoon, just as I was coming home, I was greeted by a girl standing on my doorstep. She was short, in her late 20s, and spoke in a way that was somehow clear, but at the same time incomprehensible. She told me that her bathroom was being remodeled and asked if she could use mine. Surprised, I hesitantly agreed. She followed me inside, went straight to my bathroom, as if she already knew where it was, and then silence. After 5 minutes, I knocked and said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to be leaving soon." She immediately opened the door, muttered something like a thank you, and then stood in my living room. I asked her to leave, but she requested a drink. When I refused, she asked me something that made no sense. Finally, she walked toward the door and left. At first, I thought she might be homeless, but she seemed too clean and well-groomed. Maybe she had been honest about her bathroom. Months later, she returned with the same request. This time I refused. What kind of remodel lasts that long? I pushed it out of my mind until things got stranger. One evening, my roommate Victor was cooking with the front door propped open. Suddenly, he stopped stirring, said hello to someone, and then hurried into my room. "Do you have a friend over?" he asked. "No, why?" I replied. "Because some girl just walked in and locked herself in the bathroom." My heart sank. It was her. We knocked, but she refused to answer. Since I knew a bit of lock-picking, I managed to unlock the door in about 3 minutes, but she was braced against it from the inside. Victor and I had to force it open while she screamed, "No, Daddy! Fight for me, Daddy!" It was terrifying. Then a middle-aged couple burst into the apartment. "Is our daughter in there?" the man demanded. They explained that she had not been taking her medication. Apparently, they were the previous owners of the apartment, and their daughter believed she still lived there. They apologized profusely and promised it would not happen again. But the very next day, she was back, pounding on the wall and demanding to be let in. Her parents' phone went to voicemail, so Victor and I called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived. At first, one officer tried to calm her, but when more arrived, she suddenly lashed out and attacked. She was restrained quickly, screaming in strange gibberish. Her parents arrived again, looking unsurprised. Things calmed down afterward. The girl was released into her parents' care, and we declined to press charges. The officer, who told us it was his last day before retirement, even stayed to share stories about his years on the job. He explained that he knew the family and their daughter had a severe form of schizophrenia. She resisted medication, which made everything worse, and her parents were not always careful. It was a sad situation, but one that left Victor and me with a story we would never forget. Story 8. I stopped at a rest stop on Interstate 95 while driving home from college many years ago. While I was in the bathroom, a middle-aged man made an innocuous comment about the weather to me while we were at the urinal, and I replied with something equally bland. Afterwards, I sat in my car right outside trying to fire up some music before leaving, maybe for 5 minutes, when I looked over to my right and there was the man, sitting in his car with the engine idling, just staring at me like I was prey. I had never been stared at like that before, but I knew what it meant. I took off and he pursued me in his car. I tried to lose him in the parking lot, but without luck. Just as I was going to get back on the highway to try and lose him, I decided to go back inside the rest stop and tell someone. I double parked right outside, ran in, and frantically told a security guard the story. He came outside with me and my stalker saw us and sped off toward the on-ramp. I am a man, and I almost got raped, possibly worse, at a rest stop. Story 9. Last summer, I moved into my parents' in-law apartment with my boyfriend. Their entire house has an alarm system, including our apartment door. So, a couple of months after moving in, we went on a hike together. When we returned to the car, I saw that I had a message from my parents, who were in Maine, asking if we had trouble with the alarm. While we were gone, our apartment door alarm had gone off, but the police did not catch anyone. About a month later, while I was at school and my boyfriend was at work, the alarm went off again. I received a text from my mother asking if I had trouble with the alarm, so I called her to tell her that nobody was home. Apparently, the alarm had gone off about an hour earlier, and the alarm company told my mother that the apartment door had been opened and that somebody answered the phone, used my name, and gave the wrong alarm code. My mother assumed I had forgotten the code and told them not to call the police. The door showed no damage, and there was no visible evidence anyone had been in our apartment. So I am not sure why someone would have entered. My parents have rented the apartment to many different people over the past 30 years, so it is possible someone copied a key at some point. We changed the locks and have not had an incident since, but the whole episode made me extremely paranoid. Story 10. I was scared as a kid because my dad always told me that in life, you should not be afraid of ghosts. Fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father took his own life, and I received an inheritance from him. At the time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale because my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the costs either. The cabin was set to go on the market in less than a month, and the realtor and the lawyer were finalizing the paperwork. For that month, the cabin would not be rented and would remain vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of everything that had happened. I quit work, packed my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog, and headed up in my dad's car, the one he had willed to me, to the cabin. This had been our family cabin that my parents rented out when we were not using it. I had keys and the alarm code, so I did not feel the need to stop at the rental management company to advise them of my stay. That detail has nothing to do with what happened but felt worth mentioning. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal. I spent my days playing with my dog, snowboarding, and my evenings on the balcony playing video games, listening to music, drinking, and smoking. I had stocked up on food, cigarettes, and liquor, so I was mostly shut in aside from the occasional trip to the slopes. With my dog for company and DVDs and video games for entertainment, I began to relax after all the drama. The cabin was 2 stories. The bottom had the living room, a side guest bedroom, and a small kitchen. Upstairs, there were 2 more rooms and a walkout balcony off the master bedroom. Most of my time was spent in the living room, the kitchen, or the master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept those doors shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creeped me out. On the 3rd day, while playing with my dog, his name was Midnight and he has since passed, it was snowing heavily and I decided not to drive down the hill to the main road. That was when things started to get strange. There were only 2 other cabins nearby, maybe a block away from each other. All the others were about a mile away, and we were surrounded by forest and very tall pine trees. Tall, which is important later. Both nearby cabins were empty, and I knew no one was staying there. Around midday, while outside with my dog, I noticed footprints in the snow around the area by our cabin. It was still snowing, so the prints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there within the last 20 to 30 minutes. I thought maybe someone was staying in the nearby cabin that I had not noticed. Perhaps they were shut-ins like me. The prints led away from my cabin and disappeared into the denser part of the trees, so I dismissed them and went back inside. That night I was in bed with Midnight when his ears suddenly perked up, and he jumped down and ran to the living room. I lay still and could hear him moving back and forth for about 5 minutes before he ran back upstairs and did his doggy dance to let me know he wanted to go out. Outside, he did not want to relieve himself. Instead, he pulled on the leash and tried to drag me toward where the prints had been, sniffing the side of the house and looking up at the roof. When I would not follow, he sat and stared into the darkness. I pulled him inside and we went back to bed. But about half an hour later, I heard what sounded like hooves on the roof. Only a series of about 6 steps, and the spacing felt like a human stride. Midnight raced to the balcony door as if to get out, so I grabbed my coat, shoes, cigarettes, and a flashlight and went onto the balcony to look around. I smoked and swept the roof with the light. The snow was undisturbed. I told myself it must be my imagination or a falling pine cone. Midnight might have been reacting to me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw something in a tree about 20 feet from the balcony. A figure crouched between branches, squatting on a branch with its arms reaching up to hold another branch. I froze. Midnight paced and barked softly. The thing did not move. I put out my cigarette, but something in my head screamed not to shine the light at it, so I pulled Midnight inside, locked the door, and then shone the light in its direction. There was nothing there. I closed the curtains and returned to bed. But later I heard light tapping at the screen door, like someone running their fingers along the glass, and it continued for nearly an hour. Midnight stared at the door, but would not go near it. I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door, but my dad's voice told me to stay in bed and not to. I listened. I fell asleep and woke to a normal morning. The rest of the week passed without incident. I admit it could have all been in my head. There was a lot going on at the time. Yet the footprints, the tapping, and Midnight's behavior still give me chills. Story 11. I was sitting in my ex's living room with all the doors and windows closed and no breeze when a picture frame flew off the wall, landed in the middle of the room, and slid until it hit the opposite wall. I left immediately, and that was only one of several strange things that happened in that house. People asked for more, so here is more. Another time we were sitting in her kitchen eating dinner beneath a chandelier with 5 bulbs when a single bulb began to flicker, like a stereotypical creepy light. Faster, then slower, then faster. And I noticed a pattern: 3 short flickers, then 3 long, then 3 short, which is Morse code for SOS. She shrugged it off, saying the ghost was just doing his thing, and I got up and left. One night I spent the night in her bed with the bedroom door open halfway and woke in a cold sweat to watch the door slowly start to close before suddenly slamming all at once. I woke her and made her stay up with me the rest of the night. Another time we heard a bang from the kitchen and found a bottle of laundry detergent that had fallen from the hanging basket above the cabinets. But when we looked 2 seconds later, the basket was still and not moving, even though it was extremely sensitive. Beyond these incidents, there was a constant, subtle feeling of anxiety and of being watched. She once said she had seen the ghost dressed in a Civil War Confederate uniform and that it looked like her father who had passed away about a month before I met her. Creepiest thing I have ever heard. Story 12. It is hardly the creepiest thing I have heard, but it really shook me, and I have no explanation. I was driving back from a friend's house around midnight, sober but a little sleepy, along a main road flanked by hedges and fields, when a person staggered out from one of the hedges and crossed half the road toward my car as I passed in a diagonal. I did not stop because I did not believe what I had seen. I was doing about 65 miles per hour and thought my mind was playing tricks on me. A few minutes later, an ambulance screamed past in the opposite direction at a speed I had never seen before. And then my headlights revealed what I can only describe as a massive, deep red stain across the width of the road that was utterly terrifying. There was no sign of anything dead nearby to explain the stain, and I checked the news the next day and the day after with no mention of any incident on that stretch of road that could account for it. Story 13. We used to live on an acreage until I was 12. I am 16 now. One summer day, I was home alone with my sister, who was 24 at the time, because both our parents worked during the day. Living in the country means almost no one ever comes to the door, so when we heard a persistent knock, I knew something was off. My sister usually would not answer the door when it was just the two of us, so she let them knock, but this man kept knocking for a good 2 minutes. I could see him through the half-circle window above the door, and, sorry to be stereotypical, he looked like a creep, balding with a straggly beard that seemed to grow out of his ear hair. My sister and I exchanged nervous glances. He could not see us, and there was no sign anyone was home. Yet he refused to leave, and even tried the door forcefully so that the deadbolt was the only thing between him and us. He went around the side of the house, and I followed from the window, watching him peer inside and try the back door too. And then he returned to his battered pickup to drive away. Right before closing his door, he turned and looked straight at me, and I felt my soul shrivel up inside me. After that, we called the police. I got a knife, gave a statement, and refused to stay home alone anymore. And eventually we moved, which made me feel safer than the terrifying thought that he might come back. Story 14. This all happened about 20 years ago, when my wife was 8 years old. She grew up in a rural area of West Virginia. At the time, her mother worked days as a nurse, and her father worked night shifts at the nearby steel mill. They did not have much money because they were a young couple with a young daughter, so they lived in a stationary mobile home with an attached outdoor garage and only one entrance. One night while my father-in-law was at work, my wife and her mother were about to go to sleep when they heard the handle on the door start to rattle. They ignored it at first, thinking it was the wind because the mobile home was pretty cheap, but it rattled again. My mother-in-law got up to check and saw 3 people outside the home wearing hoodies and rubber masks standing facing the door. She panicked and ran to another room to grab a pistol the family kept for protection. When she returned, the 3 were still there, one of them continuing to mess with the handle while another walked around banging on the walls and making noise. And the third went to the garage making noises there. After about 15 minutes of banging and jiggling the handle, the noises stopped and my mother-in-law could not see anyone outside. She called the police, and when they arrived, there were signs that someone had tried to get in, but nothing was taken or vandalized. That was strange because my father-in-law had valuables in the garage, speakers, electronics, and miscellaneous items worth well over $2,000 to $3,000 that could have been stolen. The police told them that when there is no theft or damage, it often means the people had been watching them, knew my father-in-law was on his shift, and had come for my wife and her mother that night. My father-in-law changed shifts after that, and they moved out of West Virginia shortly afterward. All 3 family members tell the same version of the story, although my wife was young and does not remember everything clearly. So I know it happened. It is terrifying to think how easily they could have been abducted, assaulted, or killed that night. Story 15. I was up late watching television alone in the living room when I was about 12 and heard my dog growling in the kitchen. Sometimes he growled at a cat, a squirrel, a plastic bag blowing in the wind, or the moon. So I went to check and found him standing at the door with the hair on his back raised like I had only ever seen when he was about to fight. I crept over and looked out but saw nothing, and after a minute or two I assumed it had been a raccoon and opened the door to let him out. He stepped out a few feet, stopped in front of me, and stared toward the shed in the back corner of the yard. It was the middle of the night and only the back porch light was on, which did not illuminate much. I scanned around the shed and saw nothing. Then my eyes drifted up to the tree that hung over it. There was a dark, undefined shape in the tree that, the instant my eyes fixed on it, quickly floated upward like a wisp of smoke being blown away and vanished into the night sky with no sound. No flapping, no branch rustle. My dog went absolutely crazy barking. He stayed just outside the door, so I grabbed his collar, dragged him inside, and bolted out of the kitchen to wake my mother, but she was fast asleep. To this day, I have no idea what it was. Story 16. A few years ago, I went to a few open houses with my family and my little cousin. He was 5 to 6 years old at the time. The second to last house we entered smelled strongly of incense that filled the whole place. They had 2 beds and 3 couches in the living room. The whole family lived on that one floor of the 2-floor house. My family and I looked at the first room upstairs with the estate agent while my cousin wandered around. And when I left the room to find him, he was standing outside one bedroom, terrified. I went up to him and asked what was wrong. Staring straight into the room, he said, "He's looking at me," and he told me not to move. I looked inside. It was darker than any other room, dim light seeping through thin closed curtains, and a large dark figure sitting on the bed. I wrapped my arms around my cousin and told him it was nothing, and that we would return to our family. But after 2 steps away from the room, I felt a sharp, stinging pain on my shoulder blade, up toward the upper middle of my back. We continued walking until we reached the bottom of the staircase. When I got home later, there was a long, deep scratch on my shoulder blade into the upper middle of my back that was lightly bleeding. I see now why they slept in the living room. Story 17. I used to visit a friend who lived out in a rural farming area, and I slept over a lot. We would hang out and draw, and I usually slept on the living room couch where 2 mirrors sat fairly close to the television. When the television was off and I walked by, I started seeing shadows move behind me and at first assumed it was a warped screen. But one evening I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook, bent down to pick it up, stood straight, looked in the mirror, and there was a man behind me in the hallway, average height, bald, and a bit old. When I turned around, no one was there, and when I looked back in the mirror, he was gone. Another time we heard what sounded like small children's footsteps sprinting across the upstairs even though her adult siblings were at work. So I chose to sleep in her bedroom that night, only to wake in the middle of the night and watch 4 of her posters slowly peel off the wall as if someone were carefully unsticking the tape rather than the posters falling. The next morning she shrugged and said she needed better tape. Her family eventually moved because they could not afford to stay, and one day she dug out a local news article proving why the house felt wrong. The article said a man and his granddaughter had lived there, and that he had killed her and then himself. And the photograph that accompanied the piece was the same man I had seen standing behind me. Unfortunately, I do not have the article now, and I do not live near that area anymore. So you will have to take my word for it. Story 18. I have 2 stories. The first happened when I was about 9 or 10, and my father was with me. And though many people do not believe me because I was so young, I remember it clearly. It was late at night, around 11 o'clock or midnight, and I was downstairs staring out the back window at a road that connects to a highway. The neighbors to the right were away for the summer, and the houses behind us were new and unoccupied. I saw a figure move in front of one of the new houses and kept watching, because if it walked down the road, it would reappear on the other side. What emerged was a tall, bony thing with skin so tight to its bones, you could see the joints, a snout like a crocodile's but less flat, and tiny, almost glowing red eyes. Strangely, its skin looked surprisingly human and pale, and it was naked. I called for my father. I do not recall everything after that, but my father watched it walk down the road and said it was later joined by a smaller one. My second story was no more than 2 years ago. I was home alone in the spring and glanced out the front window to see a white man in a black trench coat and black hat walking down my street. When he reached my house, a tree in my yard obscured my view, so I waited for him to reappear. But minutes passed and he never did. So I ran outside and checked behind the tree. There was no sign of him at all. The man simply vanished before my eyes, and I will never know how. Story 19. This did not happen to me, but to a friend. She once called me late at night while walking to her car because she was scared and wanted to stay on the phone in case something happened. She works as a nurse on night shift at a large but quiet hospital. Around 2 in the morning, a man came up to her at the front desk and asked if she could unlock a security door so he could get to his car in a parking lot on the other side of the building. She agreed and followed him, though he avoided eye contact and kept changing his mind about which hallway to take, leading her deeper into areas she did not know well. Eventually, he led her toward an elevator that went only down to the basement and insisted that was the way. She remembered there was a way to the south parking lot through there, but she had never used it. She followed him inside and they rode down together. When the doors opened, a man in a ski mask was waiting just a few feet away. She panicked inside but forced herself to move quickly, ran to the door the first man had pointed to, yanked it open, and then sprinted back toward the elevator and escaped. She returned to the front desk, told the other nurse on duty, and was told to just go home. That was when she called me. I barely slept after hearing it. I cannot even imagine what she felt in that moment. Story 20. I was living with a friend in a huge old mansion that was sometimes open for tours and events. One day I was in a remote corner bathroom when the door slammed shut behind me and the knob fell off. No one else was home, and my cell phone died at the same time. I was stuck for hours until an overwhelming smell of roses filled the room. The latch clicked, and the door swung open by itself. Another time I had been given a huge roll of cash to hold temporarily. I set it on top of the upright piano in my office before being called to bring some back down. When I turned, the money was gone. Panicked, I tore the apartment apart, ran downstairs to tell the owner, and she calmly told me it was right where I had left it. I rushed back upstairs and there it was, sitting squarely in the middle of the piano. The owner also gave me her late husband's antique copper cufflinks. Every day I placed them on my desk, until one day, one vanished. Weeks later, while cleaning before Christmas, I moved all the furniture from my 15 by 25-foot bedroom to vacuum when something thudded against the back of my foot. I turned to find the missing cuff link lying shiny and spotless on the floor. Relieved, I placed it next to its twin, but when I returned after stepping out for a drink, the other one was missing. Weeks later, it was discovered under a piece of furniture elsewhere in the house. Story 21. There is something called the Hornet Spook Light in Joplin, Missouri. It is a light that has been documented back to the early 1800s. It has been studied by the Army Corps of Engineers with no explanation. It is a spherical light that moves along the Missouri-Oklahoma state line. It does not have any pattern, changes colors, and sometimes splits or gets bigger or smaller. It appears to have some intelligence as it interacts with people. So on to the story. My grandpa, who passed away before I was born, took my dad and his siblings to see it back in the 1950s. There used to be a museum there. My dad decided to take us to see it on a road trip back in 1986. I was 2. I remember being out on this dark road and getting scared. My mom was pregnant with my sister at the time, so she and my grandma, my dad's mother, took me back to the van, an old Dodge Caravan, the boxy ones for those that remember. I was in my car seat in the middle seat, and my mom and grandma were up front. All of a sudden, the back of the van lit up with a bright light. My mom and grandma got really quiet and I turned around. The light danced and moved around right there behind the van. My mom freaked out and ran out of the van. My grandma stayed with me watching it. It only stayed for a little bit and then went away. My dad and siblings came over at the commotion, but I honestly do not know if they ended up seeing it. There was also a time in high school that we saw it again. It rapidly moved up and down the road, got about 20 feet from us, and rose up into the air as much as 50 feet, I would guess. The funny thing is that when we stopped at a gas station and truck stop, the locals would not give us directions to it. My dad could not remember the way. We finally found some teenagers to help us, but even then, they would not take us all the way there. Weirdest and creepiest experience of my life. You can look it up, there is no explanation. Story 22. This happened when I was a junior in high school. Some background. My bedroom was on the top floor and had a door that went out to a balcony. I always locked the door before going to bed. I got ready for bed around 11 and was sleeping when I heard my balcony door open and then shut. I was sleeping with my back to that door and kind of woke up thinking I was dreaming. Then I heard footsteps and whispering all around me. Not coherent words, just like a crowd whispering. And I did not have the courage to turn over because I was freaked out. This went on for about 20 minutes. My feet were near my bedroom door and my sister was 3 doors down. I heard her door open and everything stopped. My room went completely silent. She was about 10 at the time. I heard her use the bathroom and go back into her room. And the minute she shut her door, the footsteps and whispering started again, a little louder. I tried to get the courage to run to my parents' room. My dad was out of town, so it was just my mom. But when I grabbed my blanket and shook her, she would not wake up. She is normally a very light sleeper, but she would not stir. So I lay on her floor with my blanket shaking and crying, and eventually decided I was being silly and went back to my room. Everything seemed fine, and the only noticeable thing was that the balcony was unlocked. I locked it, got into bed, and tried to sleep, but heard the door open again. I had the blankets over my face because I was terrified and crying, and slowly my blanket started getting tugged down off my face. Every time I pulled it back up, it would be pulled down, and I felt fingers poking at my body while sobbing and begging for it to stop. Then a huge weight pressed on my chest and I could not breathe. I tried to call out to my mom, but no sound came, like trying to speak after losing your voice. I prayed in my head and the weight lifted, but the pulling and poking continued until about 4 in the morning when everything stopped and I dozed off crying. My alarm woke me at 6:30 and I went to school, but during third period I started crying uncontrollably and was sent home because I was having a breakdown. I told my mom and she had a bishop come by bless our house. It was awful and I could not bring myself to go into my room until after the blessing. Even afterward, I slept with the lights on for a while. Nothing like that ever happened again, but sometimes my books and papers would be on the floor when I came home. Story 23. Between the time I was 14 to 17 years old, a few friends and I would go behind my house and play in the woods. It did not take long for us to discover what we called Hobo Village. At the top of a super steep hill, there was a dumping ground of appliances dating back from the 1930s to the 1970s. In between the rusted appliances, there were tents and old fire sites. Every time we went out there, the tents and stuff would be moved around or removed. Anyway, one weekend, my best friend and I went out there on a mini adventure and pushed a little further from the village. In a tree with a direct line of sight pointed at Hobo Village was a tree stand. Under the tree stand were spent bullet casings, like from a high-powered rifle. After digging around looking for more casings, we discovered a cardboard box. Inside were 30-plus adult magazines. At that point, we freaked out a little and started to head back to my house. While passing through Hobo Village, we noticed something else. Holes. Lots of holes in the rusted metal, the size of the casings we had collected. Once it clicked what the holes were, we bolted and noticed something that still haunts me today. One of the appliances we thought was rust was not rust at all. It was dried blood. Someone had been using the magazines while watching people in the woods. We told my parents and they called the police. A couple days later, the officers checked it out and the tree stand was gone. They cleaned up Hobo Village and kept a squad car by a road near the woods with someone in it for a few months after. It still weirds me out today. Story 24. My partner and I were cops in the 40th precinct in the South Bronx. We got a call about an open door, so we went to the apartment. Sure enough, there was an open door, so we announced ourselves in full uniform and walked in. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing ransacked or out of place, but no one was home. We went from room to room checking closets, behind furniture, and the 2 bedrooms. Everything was eerily quiet. We checked the kitchen for food and trash and were satisfied someone lived there and had perhaps forgotten to lock up. As we were on our way out, I engaged the slam lock so the door would lock behind me. My partner stepped out first and I was just about to pull the door shut when I heard someone say bathroom. "Oh, okay, go ahead," I said. "Go ahead and what?" my partner replied. I remembered hearing a faint voice behind me and got a chill. Not good. I convinced my partner to check again, and we found no bathroom at first. Then I realized the front door, when opened, actually covered an adjoining bathroom door. I opened it and it was stuck, so I shouldered it and whammo. The sound of tape ripping and the stench of death hit me. Flies were everywhere and the body was half skeletonized in a brown slush. It turned out the man had committed suicide using a bleach mixture, sealed the doors and windows with duct tape, and lay in the bathtub with the tub half filled. His body had begun to putrefy, and he had been dead at least a week. After that incident and a few other unexplainable close calls, I firmly believe in spirits. Something had clearly said bathroom. My partner claimed he never said it and did not hear it. It definitely came from behind me. Story 25. This happened to my brother and me 3 years ago and was the weirdest thing I have ever experienced. I live in Germany near Frankfurt in a small town. I was out with friends, a bit drunk, and my brother was supposed to pick me up. Way past midnight, he finally showed up and I got in. He was completely sober while I had a pleasant buzz. It was a summer night with a clear sky. When we arrived home, I opened the gate so my brother could park the car and noticed our neighbor's broken door light blinking with a weak white glow. For the first seconds, I thought it was that light, but then I saw something much brighter and stronger. At that moment, my brother stopped the car and stared past me in sheer terror. I turned and the whole wall of our neighbor's house was covered in a white, extremely intense, blinking light radiating from their yard. We could not see the source because of the wall, but the light was powerful enough to send a shock through the neighborhood. My brother got out and we moved to peek into the neighbor's yard, but there was nothing there. We were speechless, turned around, and saw the same intense light in the yard on the opposite row of houses across the street and the train tracks, again bright enough to make us cover our eyes. After a few seconds, it stopped and was never seen again. We spent an hour smoking and drinking and discussing what it could have been, an electrical discharge in the atmosphere or something else. But we found no satisfying explanation. The light was huge, intensely bright, pure white, and left us with a weird, unnerving feeling. It made no sense. Story 26. When I was about 14, I lived in our old flat in the center of a very old town, one with nearly 2,000 years of history, and one night my mother and sister were getting ready for bed. It was a two-bedroom flat, so my sister and mother slept in one room while my dad slept in mine. He was working that night, so he could not have been the cause of the sounds I heard. My mother and sister could not have been it either because our doors were loud when opened, and the hallway door was open while their bedroom door was closed. I lay in bed trying to fall asleep and began to feel anxious for no reason I could name. A red light was burning in the living room. My door, which sat beside the living room, was open, and I was lying on my side facing the wall when I heard slow footsteps like a 200-pound person sneaking toward my room. I did not hear any doors open, so it could not have been my mom, my sister, or my dad. The steps came closer and closer, and I was crying silently by the time they reached my room. More footsteps sounded and then stopped right behind me. I did not turn around and eventually fell asleep facing the wall. I will never forget that night, and I still do not know whether to believe in the paranormal. Story 27. Two things. When I was little, about 8 years old, I was playing in my driveway with my middle sister when our basketball went across the street. Since the younger sibling always gets stuck retrieving the ball, I went to fetch it. A car came speeding by, and I stopped to let it pass. But it turned around 4 houses down and started trying to run me over. He did that about 5 times back and forth. So we told my mom and she called the police. Nothing else ever happened after that. Now, 2 years ago, I worked at a nursing home that had a lockdown dementia unit. The layout was T-shaped, the top of the T being the dining room and the stem the patient rooms. It was my first time working there, and someone suggested I leave the television on overnight because it could get creepy. I laughed and shut it off since I was reading a book and did not want the distraction. Bad idea. My back was to the dining room so I could watch the rooms in case anyone got up, and I started hearing voices behind me. I checked multiple times and was certain no one had gotten up. It happened a few times, and I finally turned the television back on. The voices stopped. I only worked there a few shifts and was glad to return to my usual group. Story 28. When I was about 8 years old, my dad took my brother, who was 2 years older than me, and me out into the Arizona desert to look at the stars. We drove out of Phoenix for about an hour until we reached a stretch of land with absolutely no lights, no moonlight that night, and only starlight. We parked at the edge of a tree line and climbed onto the car trunk to look up. After about 5 minutes of silence, my dad shrieked from the front of the car and whispered, "Get into the car now!" I whined and asked why, unable to see anything dangerous at first, but my dad grabbed us both, dragged us in, crawled into the back seat behind us, reached forward and locked the doors. Then loud pounding hit the window of the door we had just jumped into. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see a very tall, skinny, middle-aged man standing at my dad's door, with his face pressed to the glass staring in. And when my dad found his keys and turned on the headlights, we saw about 4 or 5 more men standing in front of the car, just staring. My dad asked if we could help them, and the tall man only stared. When my dad reversed slowly, the man followed and then began kicking the door and slapping the window, while the others stood motionless in the distance, so he put the car in drive and sped away. We stopped at a safe spot in a Wendy's parking lot, where my dad calmed us down and promised to always protect us. Years later, he said he thought they were homeless people looking to steal the car for a place to crash. Story 29. We had just gotten high and grabbed food before I drove my significant other home. To start it off, it is super spooky leaving her house alone because you have to pass a giant stretch of woods and some old boat-out houses. In the daytime, it looks amazing. But at night, if you look deep enough into the trees, you feel like you are going to see something you do not want to. So you get tunnel vision. On top of that, my significant other said she was delirious because she thought she was seeing people rising from the dirt like graves that night. The land is built on old indigenous burial ground, which only made her more frightened. So I am driving home, passing that stretch of woods with the usual craving for food and listening to music, when my significant other calls because she wants to make sure I get home safe. As I drive home, a car is behind me and makes every single turn I do, which freaks me out because some of the turns would make no sense to anyone who did not know the area. I tell my significant other what is happening, and she gets scared. So I keep driving around my neighborhood because I do not want them to know where I live. They finally back off and drive away, but remain within visible distance. So I circle the block so they get farther from me. When I hit the corner 3 turns from my house, an extremely bright green light blinds me, and I tell my significant other I cannot see anything. She thinks it is just a little laser people use to mess with others. But this light blinds me completely, and before I know it, I am at the corner next to my house at the stop sign. I blame being high and hungry, and my imagination mixed with supernatural thinking, but I convinced myself someone was shining a strong green ray or laser at me from the woods. I must have been really high, though. I had watched Dark Skies the night before, and the whole thing still freaks me out. Story 30. This happened about 4 years ago. My stepmother and I were watching a movie in the living room, which sits at the very center of our old house. We were stretched out on 2 couches with a low coffee table between us and the television mounted above an unused fireplace. My younger brother was already asleep. We both nodded off about the same time and remember little before falling asleep. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, we both sat up and stared at each other silently. And as we adjusted to the dark, her phone lit up on the table between us. The screen glowed and then slowly slid down the middle of the table until it reached the edge. Both of us held our breath and glanced at each other before the phone moved off the edge and hovered in midair for about 10 seconds, still showing her lock screen at full brightness. Then it slammed onto the floor with tremendous force, chipping her hard shell case and immediately going black. After taking a few seconds to breathe normally, she sat up, picked it up, and handed it to me. It was ice cold and the chip had nearly cracked the case, even though the drop appeared to be only about 1.5 feet. Our house was built in 1815. The family who built it had a young daughter who took her own life there. The property survived a tornado, and the site once housed a train stop. So many strange stories. But that moment with the phone is the most vivid and eerie for me. Story 31. I was a senior in high school when this happened during our big annual debate tournament. Every fall, the team hosted a large event where about 300 to 500 students from other schools would compete, and it was scheduled on a Saturday. So I volunteered to unlock the classrooms in the morning. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning when it happened, and I was walking the second-floor corridor with a lanyard of keys to unlock rooms. My school was built in the mid-1950s and still had many of the same features from back then. So at that hour, the building was pitch black and only the emergency lighting was on. I was using my phone's flashlight to navigate the halls. Like all old schools, ours had plenty of weird tales. One well-known story was that a student killed himself with a shotgun in the theater in the 1970s after school. So I was already on edge as I walked along Upper C Hall, where the emergency lights were off. When I reached the theater, I could not get the doors to open, even with the master key. After struggling, I finally unlocked it, but the doors would not budge open no matter how hard I pulled. After 5 minutes of useless effort, I gave up and began walking away when a gust of air blew from the theater and I turned to see the door cracked open slightly. I hurried downstairs to get away from that room and later learned that the theater's air conditioning unit sometimes created a pressure difference with the hallway, which could force the door ajar. Story 32. When I was very young, about 4 or 5 years old, strange things would happen in my house. Unexplained noises and objects moving in my bedroom while I slept, which I did not initially find frightening because my parents reacted calmly when I told them. But one incident still gives me chills. I had built a little tent by draping sheets over a small table and was lying on my stomach coloring while my parents and grandmother watched television in the living room down the hall. I felt someone grab the back of my thigh and thinking it was my father because his hand was large. I turned to look and saw a man's hand retract from under the table. but it was pale white when my dad's skin is dark like mine, the color of cinnamon. I froze as the hand slowly left my field of view, and for what felt like an eternity, probably only a second, I realized an intruder must have been in my room. I screamed. My parents burst down the hall, checked windows and closets and under the bed, and found nothing. And though everything had been locked since my dad got home and my grandmother had been there all day, we eventually moved and I never experienced anything like that again. But the memory of something touching me while everyone else was so close still gives me the creeps. Story 33. This happened to my grandmother, not to me, but I was with her at the time. We were taking a tour of the old Santa Fe prison, the site of one of the most brutal American prison riots, where the inmates took the guards hostage and controlled the prison for 3 days. And as you can imagine, it was not a pleasant weekend for many of those prisoners. A little background on my grandmother. She was born the seventh child of the seventh child, which is supposed to mean she has a heightened sixth sense. It sounds like nonsense, but she has saved people's lives by having dreams that foretold the future. For example, she once dreamed a brother would die at the bottom of a hill and warned him not to go on a fishing trip. And the people who did go were later in a serious accident when their vehicle slid off a mountain, avoiding another collision. Back to the tour, we entered cell block 3, and I noticed my grandmother suddenly seemed to be in pain. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she was cold, but she continued to act oddly until we left the prison. She was even crying, though she insisted the cold air was to blame. Once we were outside, she told me what had happened. The moment she stepped into cell block 3, her vision went black like she was about to pass out, and within seconds she regained sight but felt a sharp, stretching pain in the groin muscles between her legs as if they were being pulled apart. She is a very tough woman and refused to tell anyone because it would cut the tour short, and she knew how much it meant to me. And the pain eased the instant she walked out of the prison and vanished entirely once she reached the gates. I researched the riot and found something disturbing. Right at the entrance to cell block 3, the exact spot where my grandmother's pain began, was where inmate Archie Martinez, one of the most hated snitches, was tied spread eagle to the grills and brutally beaten, burned with an acetylene torch, mutilated with kitchen knives, and had his eyes gouged out. When he lost consciousness, they revived him with salts from the infirmary, and his torture became symbolic of the riot's terror. Maybe my grandmother felt his pain. I have returned to that prison many times on public and private tours since then. Needless to say, my grandmother declined to go with me again. Story 34. When I was 16 years old, I snuck out with my boyfriend at the time and a few friends to go for a drive. But after a huge fight with him, I decided to take my purse and walk home. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning as I started along the highway that passed through the city back to my parents' place. The brightly lit highway was fine, but as soon as I turned into a dark residential neighborhood, fear began to creep in. I was only 3 blocks from home when I glanced down a side street and saw a Jeep with its high beams pointed directly at me. I kept walking, stomach tightening, when the Jeep suddenly revved its engine and screeched down the street straight toward me. My legs reacted before my mind did. I sprinted, racing the last blocks to my parents' house as the Jeep skidded around the corner behind me. I flew up the steps, fumbling my keys, tears streaming, while the Jeep screeched to a stop in front of my house. Just as I flung the door open and slammed it shut behind me in a shrieking panic, I heard the driver's door open and close. My mother came out of her room annoyed and asked why I could not sneak in quietly if I was going to sneak in at all. I opened my mouth to explain when the man outside tried the door handle and peered through the stained glass window. He wore a dark baseball cap. My mother and I froze in silence as he jiggled the lock once more, then returned to his Jeep, only to walk back up to our door and place that morning's newspaper neatly on the welcome mat before leaving. We reported the incident, but the police said no newspaper deliveries were scheduled at that time, and no one on the delivery route even owned a Jeep. Since then, I have been terrified of going anywhere alone at night.